Okay, so this is going to be for page 188, the lead into the last chapter, which is all about materials and techniques. So you might recognize this little sketch if you're a follower of my YouTube channel. This is a little ship that I did with Copic markers, and it was on my YouTube channel with no audio. And it was also playing much, much faster. So I've slowed it down much closer to the real-time speed, and am recording some audio to go with it. So I liked this sketch because I already had it, and I liked it enough, and I wanted to put it in the book, and so I was happy that I already had this video recording of it actually being done. So I'm starting out here with a light Copic marker, which you by now have seen enough videos in the book since it's one of the last ones to know this is one of my favorite techniques. Start lightly, and this allows that nice design variation. Even though you're using a permanent marker, it allows you to still, explore the forms, explore the shapes and proportions before committing. And so this is a ship that is very similar to one that I did for the book Blast. And when I start working up a design, we don't talk a lot about design in this book. Leaving that for the design book once that eventually gets done, to really talk about proportions and all those sorts of things. But of course you have to talk about it a little bit in these kinds of sketches. That's why I start with side view. So when you start with a little side view sketch, it makes it much easier to really nail your proportions before trying to spin it and put it into perspective. As you've learned, drawing in perspective can be challenging, and when you're doing your design work, the last thing you want is to have to worry about perspective and try to make the design job any tougher than it already is. So in this case, by drawing in side view and really just thinking about shapes and proportions and sort of stance on the page as opposed to perspective, it allows your brain to focus in much more on style and shape and proportion, as opposed to all those shapes also in perspective. So I think that makes it a little bit easier, I've found at least, to come up with the original idea before you worry about turning it to 3/4 view. So I use the chisel point tip of a Copic marker, and this is usually the way I start a lot of my sketches, especially the working ones, right? When you want to explore and you want that sketch to be a working sketch, it's nice to have a medium, like a fat wide tip to a marker that you can block in value. Like I've just blocked in a light side and a shadow side on this, and that helps me to start think about, oh, okay, this is going to be a plane, the light's shining on it, this is part of a cylinder, that's in shadow, right? And then once I see the basic thing and there's enough of a definition, then I grab something and go to the next level of refinement. And this is obviously not about doing volumes at this point. This is about adding now detail, and I use line weight for that. And a lot of times I look at the marker sketch and there's subtle little value changes, and your brain can pick up on those, and it can hint at new details, especially for some random sci-fi thing like this. It's pretty easy to just make up details and tech to make it look visually interesting. And so a lot of times I see that in the value shift, like right there, there's a little value shift, and actually that's what hinted to that little side vent being created. And there's maybe like a little center vent that we see, just the fins of it, blocking in the windshield. So this is the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen that I'm using, which there's another video just on that pen only in a few pages. But this is just a little lead in to this final chapter. So there's a couple more little details. You can see with this brush pen you have to use a very, very light touch if you want to have a thin line, and then of course the thicker ones a bit more pressure. So literally is like doing a sketch with a brush, which is great to learn, and improve your draftsmanship, because one, you have to think ahead because you get a completely black line every time you touch the page, and also to draw with a thin line requires that light touch, and that will quickly improve your draftsmanship. So it's a fairly unforgiving pen. It's a difficult one to use, but if you can stick with it, it can help you improve those skills. So I'm adding details around it. Of course, the small little light cut lines are the hardest, which I was just talking about. And this is going to lead us, I think it's second to last video maybe, as far as demos go for the book. We hope you have enjoyed the book. Of course, you could be watching this out of order. Go to the good stuff at the end first. But not that this is any better, but it's just that it's obviously a little more fun than the tedious things you have to learn to understand how to do these sort of drawings. But be sure to upgrade your app and check back to the links page on our website for new added content. Having these videos is really, I think, going to make this book really interesting because we can go back and make changes to the content based on your input, and that will help it to evolve between reprints. And of course, we'll take all that input and then improve it on our reprint. But in the meantime, these are a way that we can answer questions pretty rapidly through our app and through these videos. So like I said, this ship is kind of familiar to me because this is one that I did for Blast, was similar. I'm just sort of doing it from memory, so this one's obviously going to be different. It's actually a great way to work when you're trying to improve your visual library and your styling skills. When you work from reference and you draw something from observation and then you forget about it and go away from it for a while, is not to look back at it when you draw it again, but to actually try and do it from memory. And then it will inevitably always be a little bit different, and each time you revisit it and draw it, you're going to bring sort of a new take on it each time you try to draw it from your memory. So just blocking out some lights and darks. I'm imagining that's got a big old sort of fish mouth on it at the front there. I don't know if it has some special function or not. It's just a make-believe vehicle anyway, so who knows. But I am hinting there at a little bit of one-point perspective. You can see I've mirrored that little triangle panel at the front lower jaw area, and I've mirrored it with the point on the other side, and doing the same down below here. So I am still thinking about perspective, even though it's primarily a really simple side view, and trying to put just enough into it that it gives you a sense that it has a little bit of depth and a little bit of volume, even though not really doing much in the way of shading yet. It's really just laying in details. And this part can be a little bit tedious, but it really brings line drawings to life. So when you go back in and add enough sort of visual interest. And I tried to keep primarily the videos for this book 1:1 speed. The only sped up ones are going to be off my YouTube channel, which those will slowly get swapped out for all new videos that are just related to the book. But for now I had some that work great. So as you've seen, like this one, you've seen it before, but you've seen it at a different speed and with no audio. So hopefully this adds a little bit of insight. So with all my ships or vehicles in general, there's some basic ideas that always come back. And it doesn't really matter if it has wheels or it flies, but there's this idea about packaging and that it carries people usually. And so there's a spot where you have a cockpit or some control center, and then it has to move through space, through whether it's an atmosphere or drives along a street. But there's this idea of people in one spot, and then power, and then visual cues to indicate the power source. So in this case, it's usually just air in and then air out in the case of this little flying ship. So I need some sort of thing at the front that lets air in, which is that big vent down towards the bottom front there. And then it's going to filter through and get compressed and sped up through some sort of motor or engine of some sort. And then it's going to get shot out the back through this cone, which is part of a cone shape. And so I'm hinting here a little bit of perspective. So you can see I draw an ellipse there. And that tells us that we're in a little bit of one-point perspective, fairly long lens in this case, so slow convergence. So that's a fairly thin degree ellipse. And then I'm detailing out that engine cone. and just a few strokes, right? There's enough visual sort of indication there of something going on to make it interesting. And then there's the cone shape, help bring the airflow back together after it's accelerated. And that's the basic idea. And then when it's moving through an atmosphere or space, not necessarily space, but definitely through atmosphere, we need some control surfaces. So there's a couple little wings sticking off the sides there at the bottom, and even this thing across the back, this triangle at the end, and what I just added right there might be an air brake, for instance. So little hinges that could poke out on the side when it's trying to slow down very quickly. Maybe a little side marker or a little notation like you see a lot on fighter jets there. You know, little danger stamps and all sorts of military graphics are really fun things to add. Okay, so now that I've got the basic block out done, I'm going to come back, add a little bit more marker work, and we're down into the last like 4 minutes of this demo. And so what I do is, this is really about the local value of something. And what I mean by that is, let's say it was a white ship. We could have a white ship, and then we could have panels or areas of it that are painted a darker gray. And so really not worrying about where the light's coming from, right? Because the light's coming from above, but here I am on the very top making it darker. So the reason it's darker is it's actually painted a darker value. So these could be actually different value panels, right? So think if it's a white chip and these are middle gray. Then on top of that, you also have the cast shadows, and they sort of do the same thing. That's why a lot of times you'll hear people talk about shadow graphics, and those are the graphic shapes that shadows make. And you hear a lot about local value or local color, and that's the actual painted surface, if it's a darker gray or a lighter gray in this case. And so you have to sort of think about both of those. They sort of do the same thing, which is they make interesting value shapes or changes across the surface, and that makes the surface look like it has dimension. And from a distance, to be honest, you don't know if a hole is actually really a hole on the side of a, say, white panel, or if it's actually a painted, dark shape. It could be a graphic, could be a hole. From a distance, it doesn't really matter. So that's what that pass was about. So a little bit of local value changing, like the fins across the top are darker, and then also some cast shadows. So I was rendering form and doing a little bit of local value shifting. Now starting to render a little bit more form, so I'm thinking about the side of this ship as being vertical. So wherever I have a vertical surface, I make it the same value. So the vertical on the side of the little cockpit up there is the same as the side value. Now obviously this is leading into a bit more rendering, which is our next book we're working on, How to Render, but I thought it was a fun sketch. So obviously it's primarily drawing. It's been almost entirely drawing with the brush pen and drawing with a marker, and only this last 3 minutes or so is going to be just a touch of rendering to give it a bit more volume. So here I picked a darker marker. Remember that when you work with markers, you can only go darker, so you got to kind of sneak up on that marker work. Looks like I'm deciding to do this as a local value shift, which means those panels are actually painted a darker value. So wherever I have my cast shadows on there, I just go back and I wash over it with this darker value, even on the light side. And that helps your brain to know that those are painted as opposed to changing value because of lighting. Then you usually have to pick a darker marker and come back and hit the cast shadows and do all your shading again. So first you darken down the light side, then you come back and drop in your modeling, right, your rendering of the surface again. So here I'm going to glaze back over that cast shadow and the core shadow. So I'm trying to make that entire surface go darker, the lights and the darks. And we're almost done. We've got about a minute left. So there's 2 more videos, I believe, in this last chapter on materials and techniques. one which is more Copic markers and a different pen, and one that's also about the brush pen, which I'm using here, which is just about the pen only. How to use it, pros and cons, and a little done via a little sketch demo. So casting a couple last shadows from the fuselage down onto those little horizontal wings that are sticking out. And that about wraps it up. So it probably was about a 15-minute sketch, 16 minutes. I don't exactly know what the slowdown speed is, because I couldn't find my original. So I went back to the sped up one off YouTube and slowed it down. And there you have it, the final little sketch.